The silence of Oakhaven, Pennsylvania was not a passive thing, it was an active presence, a heavy, woolen blanket that smothered sound and kept secrets pressed tight against the earth. In the spring of 1985, that silence found its epicenter at the end of Maple Creek Road, where the asphalt crumbled into gravel and the dense, ancient woods threatened to consume the property of Arthur and Eleanor Vance. They were fixtures of the community, a couple whose identities had long since merged into a single, harmonious entity known simply as the Vances. Arthur, a retired geological surveyor with knuckles thickened by decades of handling stone and soil, possessed a quiet, grounded intelligence. Eleanor, a former librarian whose gentle demeanor belied a fierce intellect, was the town's unofficial historian. They were in their late 60s, childless by circumstance, but parents to a sprawling, meticulously curated 3-acre garden that was the envy of the county. Their love for one another was palpable, a comfortable, worn-in thing visible in the way Arthur always instinctively reached for Eleanor's hand when walking over uneven ground, or how Eleanor would finish Arthur's sentences with a soft smile before he even realized he had paused. They were the embodiment of safety, of predictability in a world that felt increasingly chaotic in the mid-80s. Saturday, May 18, 1985, broke with the crystalline perfection of peak spring. The air was crisp, smelling of damp loam and pine resin. It was the kind of day that demanded industry. According to later testimonies from neighbors who lived down the road, the closest being nearly a quarter-mile away, the Vances had been planning this weekend for months. Arthur had secured, through avenues he kept vaguely secretive, even from Eleanor, a batch of extremely rare heirloom seeds. He had spoken to the feed store owner in town about them with a trembling excitement, describing them not just as plants, but as a legacy project, something ancient that required the precise alchemical balance of Oakhaven's unique soil composition. The last confirmed sighting of the couple was at 9:30 a.m. Local teenager, hired to clear brush on an adjacent property, saw them standing near the edge of the woods behind their house. He recounted seeing Arthur kneeling, his arm buried deep in a freshly dug hole, while Eleanor stood over him, holding a burlap sack and gesturing towards the tree line. They looked, the boy would later tell Sheriff Brody, utterly absorbed. They didn't wave. They didn't look up. They were focused on the earth with a singular, almost religious intensity. By Monday morning, the routine of Oakhaven began to snag on their absence. Eleanor missed her weekly volunteer shift at the Historical Society archives. Arthur failed to show up for his standing chess game at the diner. It was the mail carrier, a man named Higgins with a rigid adherence to schedule, who first articulated the growing dread. The Vance mailbox was full. Saturday's delivery was untouched. Higgins drove up the long gravel driveway, his tires crunching loudly in the oppressive quiet. The house, a sturdy 1920s craftsman, stood mute. The front door was unlocked, not uncommon for Oakhaven in those days, but unsettling nonetheless. Inside, the house was a perfectly preserved tableau of interrupted life. 2 cups of coffee sat cold on the kitchen counter, a film having formed over the dark liquid. A newspaper lay open to the crossword puzzle, partially completed in Eleanor's neat script. Arthur's reading glasses rested on top of the page. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, just an overwhelming, suffocating stillness. It was out back, in the sprawling garden, where the true anomaly lay. Sheriff Jim Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen the darkest corners of the county for 30 years, arrived on the scene within the hour. The air in the garden felt colder than elsewhere, heavy with the metallic tang of overturned earth. Near the tree line, where the manicured lawn surrendered to the encroaching forest, they found the Vance's tools. Arthur's heavy-duty spade was plunged upright into the soil, standing like a tombstone. Eleanor's canvas gardening gloves were neatly folded on a nearby tree stump, next to a half-empty glass of iced tea that had long since watered down from melted ice. But of Arthur and Eleanor, there was no trace. The initial search was exhaustive. Brody mobilized the entire department, supplemented by dozens of volunteers and canine units from the state police. They combed at the 3 acres of garden inch by inch before pushing into the dense woods that bordered the property. The terrain was unforgiving: steep ravines, thick underbrush of rhododendron and mountain laurel, and hidden sinkholes common to the region's limestone geology. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, state-of-the-art for 1985, flew grids over the canopy, but the dense spring foliage proved an effective shield for whatever lay beneath. The days turned into weeks. The investigation transitioned from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, and finally to a baffling cold case. The lack of physical evidence was maddening. There were no tire tracks other than their own and the mail carrier's. The Vances' 1978 station wagon sat unused in the garage. Their bank accounts remained untouched, and they had simply ceased to be. In the absence of facts, the town's imagination began to fester. Whispers filled the void. The satanic panic was gripping parts of the nation, and soon, hushed rumors circulated about cult activity in the deep woods, suggesting the Vances had stumbled upon something they shouldn't have seen. Others pointed fingers at the spectral figure of Elias Thorne, a reclusive Vietnam veteran living off-grid in a shack miles deep in the forest. Brody brought Thorne in. The man was erratic, paranoid, ranting about subterranean vibrations and the geometry of the trees. But he possessed an ironclad alibi for that weekend, having been detained in the next county over for a drunk and disorderly charge. The only piece of physical evidence that defied explanation was found by Brody himself on the third day of the search. Near the spot where Arthur's spade was found, the soil had been disturbed in a peculiar way. It wasn't just dug up, it looked churned, almost pulverized over an area roughly 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. The patterns in the dirt were strange, swirling formations that didn't match any animal digging or tool marks Brody had ever seen. It looked less like gardening and more like the site of a localized seismic event. And in the center of this churned earth, Brody found a single, tiny fibrous seed husk, black as obsidian and harder than stone. It was unlike anything in the agricultural databases they cross-referenced. It was catalogued, bagged, and eventually filed away in an evidence box that would gather dust for decades. By the autumn of 1985, the search was officially scaled back. The yellow police tape, whipped and faded by sun and rain, eventually sagged and broke. The Vances became a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. Their house sat empty, a monument to the unresolved. The bank eventually foreclosed, but the property refused to sell. It held a stigma that repelled buyers, a psychic weight that hung over the land. Nature, intolerant of vacuums, began to reclaim what was hers. The meticulously curated garden went wild. Weeds choked out the delicate prize-winning roses. Vines scaled the sides of the house, cracking the siding and prying at the window frames. The forest crept forward, swallowing the lawn foot by foot. The spot where the Vances vanished disappeared beneath a thicket of thorns and aggressive ivy, burying the mystery under layers of green growth. 39 years passed. The world sped up, digitized, and forgot. Oakhaven changed, highways bypassing the town, draining its economy and leaving it further isolated. The legend of the Vances faded from a sharp, painful memory into a dull, historical footnote, something referenced only when the anniversary of their disappearance rolled around in the local paper's looking back section. In 2024, the silence was finally broken by the roar of diesel engines. A contested probate process had finally concluded, and the Vance property was purchased by an aggressive out-of-state development firm with plans to raze the decaying structures and subdivide the land for luxury cabin rentals. The past was to be bulldozed to make way for the future. Before the demolition could begin, however, an environmental impact survey was required due to the property's proximity to protected wetlands. To Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant, somewhat aloof botanist specializing in woodland ecosystems, Eris was the grandniece of Elias Thorne, the long-deceased hermit once suspected in the Vances' disappearance. She had grown up with the shadow of that accusation hanging over her family name, a connection to the town's deepest mystery that she resented and tried to ignore. Eris arrived at the property on an overcast Tuesday in late April, armed with a tablet for digital mapping, high-resolution drone equipment, and a profound sense of unease. The Vances' house was a rotting husk, the roof partially collapsed, looking like a bruised eye staring out from the overgrown foliage. The air here still felt different, stiller, colder, charged with a dormant energy. Her mandate was simple: catalog any endangered flora before the bulldozers arrived on Monday. She began at the perimeter, working her way inward. The garden was a chaotic war zone of plant life. Yet, as she moved deeper into the overgrown heart of the property, she began to notice strange anomalies. Beneath the choking layer of invasive species, some of the original structure of Arthur Vance's design remained, and something else was happening. In the areas surrounding the original garden beds, Aris found evidence of extraordinary, almost impossible growth rates in standard local flora. Ferns grew to prehistoric sizes. Common mosses formed intricate, crystalline structures she had never encountered in any textbook. The soil composition readings on her digital analyzer were erratic, but showing impossible concentrations of rare minerals and an unidentified organic compound that seemed to vibrate with low-level energy. Drawn by a pull she couldn't entirely articulate, a mix of scientific curiosity and ancestral dread bequeathed by her great-uncle Aris, found herself pushing toward the tree line, towards the infamous spot where the Vance's tools had been found 39 years prior. The area was now an almost impenetrable wall of briars and twisted saplings. It took her nearly 2 hours of grueling work with a machete to hack a path through. The air grew heavier as she breached the thicket. The sounds of the nearby road, already faint, vanished completely. Even the birdsong seemed to die in its throat. She stepped into a clearing that felt unnaturally preserved. The light here was diffuse, filtered through a canopy so dense it felt subterranean. And there, in the center of the clearing, in the exact spot where Sheriff Brody had noted the bizarrely churned earth in 1985, the garden had produced its final, terrifying bloom. It was a patch of flowers, roughly 7 feet by 4 feet, growing in a swirling, almost hypnotic pattern that mirrored the disturbed soil from the cold case files Aris had secretly reviewed. The plants themselves were botanical nightmares, thick, fleshy stalks the color of bruised plum, topped with blooms the size of dinner plates. They were not beautiful in any conventional sense. They were compelling, repellent, and deeply, deeply wrong. Aris approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air around the patch smelled faintly of ozone and old copper. As she drew closer, the structure of the petals became clear. They were not arranged in spirals or symmetry. The fleshy, cream-colored petals were fused and folded, wrinkled and pigmented in ways that defied nature. She dropped to her knees, her breath catching in a strangled gasp. She wasn't looking at flowers. She was looking at a mirror. The bloom nearest to her, growing slightly taller than the rest, bore a configuration of folds, indentations, and subtle shifts in pigmentation that formed an undeniable, photorealistic resemblance to a human face. But it was a face trapped in a silent, eternal scream of organic matter. The brow was furrowed petal tissue, the eyes were deep, dark recesses in the center of the bloom, the mouth a contorted twist of fibrous material. It was the face of Arthur Vance. Trembling, Aris turned her gaze to the slightly smaller bloom beside it. The features were softer, the expression one of profound sorrow rendered in plant tissue. Eleanor Vance stared back at her from the soil she had loved too much. The entire patch was a grotesque gallery. Dozens of smaller blooms echoed the features of the 2 primary flowers, a cascading generational trauma rendered in leaf and bloom. They weren't just shaped like faces in the way a cloud might resemble a rabbit. They were precise, anatomical botanical sculptures, possessing an uncanny valley quality that triggered a primal, nauseating terror in Aris. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the surrounding trees, but the face flowers remained perfectly still, their fleshy petals rigid. As Aris stared, paralyzed by the horrific impossibility before her, she realized the eyes of the Arthur bloom, those dark, cavernous centers, seemed to shift. They weren't just markings, they were depth, and they were looking directly at her. And the 39-year silence of Oakhaven had ended. The Vances hadn't just returned, they had bloomed. And as Eris scrambled backward, fumbling for her satellite phone, she realized with dawning horror that the development company wasn't about to destroy a garden. They were about to unearth a graveyard where the dead didn't stay buried, but grew. The cold case wasn't just open, it was alive, and its roots ran deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. The human mind is engineered to reject the impossible. Faced with an anomaly that violates the fundamental laws of biology and existence, the brain's first instinct is to categorize it as a hallucination, a trick of the light, or a localized psychosis brought on by stress or environmental toxins. Eris Thorne's scientific training initially tried to impose this rational framework onto the horrific tableau in the Oakhaven woods. She told herself it was pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random patterns, like seeing Jesus on toast or a man in the moon. But as she scrambled backward through the briars, her boots slipping on the damp leaf litter, the high-resolution photographs she had instinctively captured on her tablet told a different story. Frozen on the screen, immune to the tricks of adrenaline and fear, the image was irrefutable. The vascular structure of the petals didn't just mimic the topography of Arthur Vance's face, it replicated it. The delicate ridges around the eyes, the specific asymmetry of his jawline, known from decades-old missing persons posters, it was all rendered in terrifying, fleshy botanical detail. Eris fled the property, the silence of the woods now replaced by the roaring blood in her ears, and the sense of being watched, of being seen by those cavernous, dark eyes, pursued her until she reached the relative safety of her rental car on the gravel road. She locked the doors, her breath fogging the windows, the modern sanctuary of the vehicle feeling pathetically fragile against the ancient, benevolent weight pressing in from the tree line. She drove straight to the county sheriff's station, bypassing the local Oakhaven outpost for the main branch in the county seat. Sheriff Brody was long dead, his obsession with the Vance case buried with him. The current sheriff, a pragmatic woman named Miller with a background in digital forensics and a profound distaste for Oakhaven's folklore, had listened to Eris's breathless report with practiced patience. It was only when Eris laid the tablet on the desk, zooming in on the central bloom, that Miller's professional detachment cracked. The color drained from the sheriff's face. In high definition, the horror was undeniable. The texture wasn't leafy, it was epidermal. By late Tuesday afternoon, the Vance property was once again festooned with crime scene tape, a ghostly echo of 1985. This time, however, the response was militaristic in its efficiency. The hazmat teams, State Bureau investigators, and agricultural specialists descended on the site. And the development company, Apex Corp, was furious, their lawyers already filing injunctions to lift the stop work order, citing eco-terrorism and staged hoaxes. They had a demolition scheduled for Monday morning, and millions were on the line. The investigation immediately bifurcated. One team focused on the present impossibility in the garden, the other dove back into the past. Eris, tethered to the investigation by her discovery and her unfortunate family connection, was allowed limited access as an expert consultant. The comparison between the 1985 files and the 2024 reality was stark. Sheriff Brody's handwritten notes, typed reports on yellowing paper, and grainy film photographs seemed almost quaint. Yet amidst the analog data, the single piece of physical evidence Brody had catalogued, the obsidian-like seed husk, remained in evidence storage. When the technician removed it from its decades-old plastic bag, the air in the sterile lab seemed to drop 10 degrees. Under a modern electron microscope, the husk defied classification. It wasn't carbon-based in a way terrestrial biology understood. It showed crystalline structures more akin to geological formations, yet it possessed the cellular architecture of a seed designed for germination. It was a bridge between stone and life. Meanwhile, at the site, the hazmat team attempted to take samples from the Arthur bloom. The process was disastrous. As the scalpel breached the thick, purplish outer layer of the petal, a thick, viscous fluid, dark as crude oil and smelling intensely of iron and ozone, pressurized outward. The attending technician screamed, dropping the tool as the fluid burned through his protective suit in seconds, leaving angry, necrotic blisters on his skin. The garden was defending itself. The area was immediately evacuated and established as a biohazard zone. Drones were deployed for surveillance. Then, the footage they returned that night was the stuff of nightmares. Under the cold gaze of infrared cameras, the patch was not dormant. The Arthur and Eleanor Blooms were shifting, their expressions contorting in slow, agonizing spasms. The silent screams were flexing. Even more terrifying, the dozens of smaller, surrounding blooms were maturing rapidly. Features were becoming distinct in the fleshy petals, faces that local historians brought in to review the footage that began to hesitantly identify as other long-term missing persons from the tri-state area, disappearing over a span of 50 years. The Vance garden wasn't just a grave for two, it was a repository. With the physical site locked down, Aris focused her desperation on the historical record. The question wasn't just what they had become, but how this had begun. She received permission to enter the condemned Vance house, now stabilized with temporary supports. The interior was a time capsule rotted by damp and neglect. The calendar still read May 1985. It was in Arthur's study, a moldering room choked with crumbling geological texts, that she found the key. The floorboards beneath his heavy oak desk were loose. Hidden in the joists was a canvas-wrapped journal, its pages swollen with damp but legible. The entries from the spring of 1985 painted a picture of a man descending into ecstatic madness. Arthur, the grounded man of stone, had found something during his final professional survey in a deep, uncharted limestone cavern system miles north of Oakhaven. He described breaking through a rock wall into a sealed chamber, a place where the geology felt wrong, where the rock hummed. He wrote of finding the seeds resting on a pedestal of natural obsidian formation. He described the immediate psychic connection he felt to them, a whispering in his mind that promised not wealth, but continuity. The seeds, the whispering told him, were the original life of the planet, dormant deep beneath the crust, waiting for the right hands to bring them to the surface sun. The entries grew increasingly erratic. He spoke of the great germination. He confessed to Eleanor, who was initially horrified. But Arthur wrote of how the seeds sang to her too, eventually soothing her fears, convincing her that their childless legacy could be cured by planting something eternal. The final entry, dated Friday, May 17, 1985, the night before they vanished, was a scrawl of terrifying clarity. The soil is ready. We are the compost. We are the trellis. We do not die, we bloom. We will see the sun forever. They hadn't been murdered. They hadn't gotten lost. They had planted themselves as willing sacrifices to a primordial botanical horror. By Sunday night, the situation at the site had become unsustainable, and the development company, leveraging immense political pressure and the lack of a definitive identification of the plants, as human remains, managed to get a court order to proceed with clearing the site, arguing that the biohazard was exaggerated by local authorities to stall progress. The federal agencies were hesitant to override a local judge without concrete proof of a pathogen. The deadline was dawn Monday. Sunday night at the perimeter was an exercise in psychic terror. The floodlights set up by Apex Corp illuminated the edge of the woods with a harsh, artificial glare. Beyond that light, the darkness felt thick and pressurized. The sounds coming from the garden were no longer silent. A low-frequency vibration, just on the edge of human hearing, emanated from the earth, rattling the teeth of the security guards and causing electronics to glitch. It sounded like a massive subterranean breathing. Aris, standing at the command post half a mile away, watched the drone feeds. The Arthur and Eleanor Blooms had grown significantly in 48 hours, now nearly 4 feet tall. Their faces were distended, the expressions stretched into impossible dimensions of agony. The eyes, those deep, cavernous centers of the flowers, were wide open, reflecting the infrared light like the eyes of nocturnal predators. They were all looking toward the access road where the heavy machinery was staged. Dawn broke gray and heavy on Monday morning. The air was thick with impending rain and the diesel fumes of the Apex Corp equipment. Over the strenuous objections of Sheriff Miller and the terrified warnings of the scientific team, the site foreman gave the order to commence clearing. Two massive bulldozers rumbled to life, their steel tracks chewing up the gravel road as they approached the tree line. The plan was to push straight through the dense brush, bury the anomaly under tons of filled dirt, and cap the area with concrete. Aris watched on a monitor in the command trailer, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The lead bulldozer breached the thicket surrounding the garden clearing. As the heavy steel blade made contact with the perimeter of the swirling patch, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, and the sound that erupted wasn't mechanical. It didn't belong to the bulldozer. It was a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the brain stem, a wet, tearing shriek that resonated from the earth itself. On the monitor, Aris watched as the Arthur Bloom violently whipped back and forth, its fleshy stalk thickening, pulsing with dark veins. The ground beneath the 50-ton bulldozer didn't just collapse, it liquefied. The machine tilted wildly as the earth churned beneath it, mirroring the swirling patterns in the soil first noted by Sheriff Brody 39 years ago. Then the roots emerged. They erupted from the soil like titanic, thrashing constrictor snakes thick as telephone poles, slick with the same corrosive black fluid that had burned the technician. They weren't wood, they were sinew and hardened cellulose, moving with impossible speed and sentient intent. The roots wrapped around the bulldozer, crushing the reinforced steel cage of the cab like aluminum foil. The driver's screams were lost in the roar of the earth and the shrieking of metal. The second bulldozer tried to reverse, its tracks slipping desperately in the mud, but more roots burst from the ground behind it, boxing it in. It wasn't a demolition, it was a feeding. The cameras on the bulldozers cut out one by one as they were dragged down into the churning loam. The drone overhead captured the final, horrific image before it was knocked out of the sky by a lashing tendril. The Arthur and Eleanor Blooms, standing tall amidst the chaos, their faces contorted not in pain, but in a terrifying, ecstatic release as the garden consumed the intruders. Then silence slammed back down over Oakhaven. The vibration ceased. The churning earth stilled. The official report, heavily redacted and classified by federal agencies that arrived within the hour, categorized the event as a catastrophic, localized geological collapse due to unknown subterranean sinkhole activity, exacerbated by heavy machinery vibration. The deaths of the two equipment operators were listed as tragic industrial accidents, their bodies deemed unrecoverable due to the instability of the ground. Apex Corp went bankrupt in the subsequent lawsuits and cover-ups. The Vance property, along with a 5-mile radius of surrounding forest, was seized by the Department of the Interior, fenced off with barbed wire and high-voltage barriers, and designated as a protected, albeit highly restricted, geological research zone. Signs warning of unstable ground and toxic soil kept the curious away. Oakhaven slowly withered, the stigma of the sinkhole disaster the final nail in the town's coffin. The remaining residents moved away, leaving ghost streets and empty storefronts to be reclaimed by the encroaching woods. Aris Thorne left Pennsylvania a week after the event. She moved across the country to the high desert, as far from deep soil and dense forests as she could get. She took a job analyzing satellite imagery, keeping her work distant, digital, and dry. But she couldn't escape what she knew. Before she left, she had run one final, unauthorized scan of the seismic data recorded during the event. The data from the deep ground sensors didn't show a localized anomaly. It showed a vast, interconnected network. Like the root system that had surfaced in the Vance garden wasn't an isolated organism. It was merely a fingertip. The seismic map showed thick, pulsing veins running deep beneath the entire abandoned town of Oakhaven, stretching out for miles beneath the county, dormant and waiting. The Vances had been the first to nurture it, the first to be absorbed into its horrific communion. But they were only the beginning of the harvest. Every night, in the silence of the desert, Aris would close her eyes and see the face of Arthur Vance, rendered in screaming petals, looking at her, knowing that beneath the earth something ancient was finally waking up, and it was hungry.